Welcome back for the third session of the OECD Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. We are focusing on securing natural capital. And we have had different sessions earlier focusing on land-based natural capital. And just before the break, we had that very good interactive discussion on ocean-based natural capital. Now here we're going to focus on financing. And I'm very happy to introduce our moderator for this session, Professor Alexander Bassen. He's a professor and chair of capital markets and management at the University of Hamburg. And he's also the member of German Council on Sustainable Development. So with that, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kumi, for the nice introduction and saying welcome to all of you. I'm very happy to share this session on financing for natural capital, because all the things we discussed in the session before strongly depend on financial flows, both public flows and private flows. And if you look at the landscape right now, we do see that there is probably not the progress we expect in terms of, for example, the integration of biodiversity in investment decisions or impact measurement, risk assessment, due diligence. So there are a lot of different tools where we would like to see an integration of biodiversity in investment decision. And this is exactly what we would like to address in this session. The question of global biodiversity financial flows. We will discuss on data gaps, on reporting on biodiversity, and last but not least, how to scale up public and private financing for biodiversity, but also other natural capitals. And I'm very happy that we will discuss this with different very pronounced panelists over here. The discussion will be structured using different policy questions. We think it makes sense to address what are the main drivers of this discussion. So therefore, we will lead the discussion based on these questions. For example, how can governments and multinational financial institutions contribute to scaling up nature capital and biodiversity finance? We will also talk about the opportunities that the conservation of sustainability use of biodiversity and natural resources generate for the financial sector. So it should not only be focused on the question of what kind of risk do we need to integrate in risk management, we would also discuss the opportunities that are linked to biodiversity in that field. But of course, if we think about risk, this is something we do have to address, and also instruments, how to cover that risk. For example, what kind of governance, risk management, or due diligence practices can ensure that we generate impact by taking biodiversity and natural capital into account. And last but not least, the fourth policy questions we would like to address here is the question of data availability and data gaps, because this is always a problem we have to overcome. You're all aware of that, and this is why we would like to discuss that over here. And I'm very, very, very happy that we have 4 panelists and 1 scene setter today. Katja Karusakis, she's from the biodiversity program. She's biodiversity program leader in the climate, biodiversity and water division at OECD. But we also have 4 other panelists for the discussion later, which will be Kevin Urama. He's right now Senior Director of the African Development Institute. He's professor at several institutions, and he's a senior executive in a lot of private and academic institutions as well. We will also have on the panel Ladislav Smija. He's right now the head of sustainability at Mirova, an investment company with a very special focus. We will learn much more about that later. And before joining Mirova, he was working with PwC, which is also quite interesting background, I think. Marine de Bazelière, she's head of sustainability at HSBC for continental Europe, with a lot of experience in that field. And we will learn a lot from her perspective, how banking industry is changing in terms of addressing nature risks. Last but not least, we will also have Katie Catwards on the panel. She's a policy fellow at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London, and working in the field of sustainable finance. She will also address some of the issues that are interesting here from an academic perspective based on her work she did in that field. So I'm very, very much looking forward to that. We will start with the first scene-setting presentation of Katja. So Katja, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Here we go. So just to check, can you see that?
Now we can see it, yes.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you to everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here today. What I'm going to go through in these first few minutes is first provide a quick overview of the global biodiversity finance landscape, covering both public and private finance flows, so what we know today. I'm then going to go through some examples of how to scale up finance for biodiversity and for natural capital, and finally conclude with some current gaps in tracking both public and private finance flows and some recommendations on how these can be addressed. So we had prepared a report in April 2020 called A Comprehensive Overview of Global Biodiversity Finance, where we looked at public, private finance flows, domestic and international level. And we, based on available data, we found that there's approximately 78 to 91 billion dollars a year flowing to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. And here in the figures, we see the breakdown that domestic public finance, so from government budgets, is the largest, the lion's share of this finance. In terms of international public finance, a lower range, approximately on average of $5 billion a year. And then finally, the private finance flows, ranging between $6 to $13 billion a year. And I'll come back to the private finance flows in a second, but I do want to note that in terms of the different quality of the data and the comprehensiveness of the data, that it is in regard to the private finance flows that the data is the weakest, I would say, at this point in time. Another thing that we looked at, though, in addition to the finance that was flowing to protect biodiversity, was what are the government support, what does the data show in terms of government support that is potentially harmful to biodiversity? And we found that based on data collected at the OECD on fossil fuel subsidies, on the potentially most environmentally harmful support to agriculture, and etc., is that currently around 500 billion is spent in government support that is potentially harmful to biodiversity. So more than 5 times the amount that is being spent globally to protect biodiversity. So a huge sort of disjunction here in our global goals for the CBD, the Conventional Biological Diversity, for the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. And so coming now to different types of ways to scale up finance for biodiversity and natural capital, I'm just going to quickly highlight some key initiatives and work underway and ways to track finance and how to scale up the finance for biodiversity and natural capital, looking at green budgeting, which is mainly public finance, looking at how to scale up economic instruments, which covers both public and private finance. I'll also touch on the new initiative being developed, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and some OECD work on guidelines on responsible business conduct. So just to highlight that at the OECD in 2017, an initiative was established called the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting. And the objective there is to align public budgets with environmental goals. The initiative was started also with France and Mexico, and together with the OECD, and a number of other countries are partners to the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting. And so it's important because also from a biodiversity perspective, it's very important to understand how much finance is allocated through public budgets to protect biodiversity, and how much is also potentially harmful. So the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, the objective is to look at both positive flows and harmful flows in the budget vis-a-vis biodiversity. And there are now different examples of initiatives that have already been undertaken and country studies. Some notable ones is in the EU that has undertaken biodiversity tagging in their EU budget. France, which has recently released its green budget looking through the 2021 budget and has identified both positive and harmful flows, together with Ireland and Mexico are two other examples. In terms of other means to scale up finance for biodiversity and natural capital, economic instruments are another key way that both have the ability to target finance to promote biodiversity, and they also provide the private sector with continuous incentives to move towards more sustainable production and consumption patterns. At the OECD, we track a number of different economic instruments, such as environmentally related taxes, fees and charges, the positive subsidies as well, and tradable permit schemes. Here, I just show a figure of the number of countries currently with biodiversity relevant taxes. This is based on data that's in our policy instruments for the environment database, the PINE database. Here in terms of number of countries, but we have it in terms of number of instruments, also for all the other economic instruments I mentioned. And just to note as an example, from the currently 110 countries are reporting to this database. So you see here we have around 50 to 60 countries that have biodiversity relevant taxes in place. And these taxes together have mobilized approximately $7 billion a year. So they are a means of raising finance, and if they're also earmarked afterwards, they can be channeled back into biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. I would also like to note, however, if you see on the figure, there's not been that much progress since 2010, which is, for example, when the Convention on Biological Diversity, the strategic framework was agreed upon. And this holds true also for the other economic instruments that we track. So there's certainly a scope to scale up the use of these economic instruments, such as taxes, fees and charges, etc. Turning now to ways to engage the private sector. Recently, what is going on now is work to build towards a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. This is similar to the TCFD for climate, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, though most likely with a broader scope to be determined, given also the complexities of the biodiversity, the differences in terms of the characteristics of biodiversity compared to climate. So in September 2019, an informal working group was established together with a technical expert group, currently looking at different scoping issues for the eventual TNFD. And some of the issues that are being considered there are the scope. So will it cover risks? Will it cover impacts and dependencies? The different types of finance that would be covered within a TNFD, and also the data issues. So to examine the feasibility of what type of data exists today, what are the gaps, and how can we actually put this towards in practice. Another example of engaging the private sector is, for example, through OECD work on tools and instruments on responsible business conduct. This provides guidance for businesses to consider environmental and social responsibility across their different management aspects. And for example, we have the OECD guidelines for M&Es, which include government-backed recommendations, which almost 50 governments have partnered with globally on all areas of business risk, responsibility, including environment, covering also biodiversity. And then the OECD supply chain due diligence guidance provides recommendations for how companies, including investors, to put the RBC into practice through risk-based due diligence. And an example there, the OECD FAO guidance for responsible agricultural supply chains refers to a number of environmental issues spanning the sustainable use of natural resources and biodiversity, together with recommendations of how to put those in place. And coming towards the very end, in terms of some recommendations on how to improve the assessment, tracking and reporting of biodiversity finance flows, what we have now through the Convention on Biological Diversity is a financial reporting framework. Through our work at the OECD, we had made some recommendations to make that data have it collected in a more granular method, to allow better comparability across the data that is available versus not, so to be more explicit about what is versus not included. Also recommendations to further develop and hopefully also agree on an internationally harmonized approach for assessing and tracking private biodiversity finance. Definitely further efforts to increase national level efforts to identify and assess harmful public expenditure. And finally, to establish a common framework on private finance. So I'll stop there. This is just a quick slide of some of the various work, and I'll pass on back to Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katja. That was really a very comprehensive overview what you did here. And I think it's quite surprising, and it's really worth reading your report. I can only recommend it. If you look at the amount of finance that is necessary, and if you look at the different sources right now, which you just pointed out, that the government is really taking the biggest part of this necessary finance until now. But on the other hand, we do see that there is also strong support for activities that harm biodiversity, also from the government. So therefore, this imbalance is something we should definitely discuss later on. And thank you also for explaining all the different initiatives we have right now. I think this is quite promising to see what is going on. You mentioned especially the TNFD, and what scares me a little bit that we do see that the economic instruments, you mentioned the example of taxation, that there is not really an improvement in the last 10 years for this tax example. And hopefully we can see some more promising examples later on in the discussion. And you also pointed out that the tracking is a very important issue to really understand what is a positive and a negative effect on biodiversity. So thank you very much for this introduction. And I would like to start directly with the first panel intervention with the first question. And I would like to address this first question to Professor Kevin Urama. Because what we just learned in this presentation, and most of you read the report in advance, I think, is that it's a lot about methods. So my first question to Kevin would be, what kind of methods for the integration of green growth and natural capital in sovereign risk assessment do you see, and can you give us an idea of how to evaluate these different methods? Kevin.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. First, I'll start from trying to think through a little bit about, once we talk about natural capital, that's quite a very clear steer towards the perspective of looking at ecosystem erosion, degradation of biodiversity, deforestation, and all these issues as if natural capital is out there and it's only the externalities that we care about. In terms of financing natural capital, I would like to for us to start seeing financing natural capital as an asset class. Financial flows always goes to assets. So we need to think about how to make sure that we see natural capital as an asset class that can be invested in, just as we invest in other assets as well. So we know one often hears in banks and in commercial banks and in the financial market, let your money work for you. I would like us to start hearing, let your natural capital work for you. And it is from this perspective that I'm going to be sharing some of the ways and methods that I think that development finance institutions and the private sector and also governments needs to start investing in natural capital in that way. And therefore, it becomes part of something that could be used as investment risk guarantees going forward. One, in terms of scaling financing for natural capital, we need to do three things. One, understand what you have, where they are, and who has the license, the legal rights to be able to use them. Because it's only when you have these characteristics that an asset can become a guarantee for investments. So we need to try and do that. So from the areas of exploration, from contracting, extraction, and so on, we need to build in a lot more transparency, a lot more clarity in regulations, and so on, so that natural capital, and I don't mean just biodiversity and ecosystem services, but natural capital as an asset class, the land, the air, the water, and all those things, the fishes, the blue economy, the green economy, that all these things are there as assets that you can actually place legal rights on, and that is clear that is there. Then the second is understanding the value of natural capital itself and how you can beneficiate it, how you can add value to it. Just like I can buy a house and improve the house so that it worth a lot more, and then it attracts investments because I've improved, I've added value, I've added some form utility to that asset. So that's the second thing that needs to be done with regard to natural capital as well, for it to start becoming something that we can use in those areas. Then the third point is to understand the social, economic, and environmental externalities, the impacts of investing in that natural capital on other things that we care about. The environment and social governance issues becomes important. The corporate social responsibility in terms of how we share the resources, I mean, the rents that come from that asset is also part of it. Value chain audits in terms of where can we add more value to it is also part of it. And also considering, especially for natural capital in the greening world, asset stranding questions. When can this asset become an opportunity for future income flows that can be used as a guarantee for other things? Now, the instruments, if I come to the instruments, already Katia has talked about green budgeting and green bonds. That's a very clear one, and I don't need to talk so much about it. But for countries to actually ensure that you can, your natural capital can become an asset class, we need to try and invest a little bit more on sovereign wealth funds, where the financial flows from this natural capital can actually be stored for the future generation. And in doing that, to create instruments such as sinking funds and stabilization funds, so that people know that this is not for consumption, and then it can become a risk, an asset that one can use for risk ratings and so on. Improving a little bit more on nature-based loans, which is basically, collateralizing the future income streams from natural capital, could become another thing that we need to think about in a little bit more. Critical there is natural capital accounting. If we don't know what it is and we can't account for it, it is really very difficult to begin to try and use it for a risk guarantee for countries and so on. We've talked about data systems. It is very crucial as well. I don't need to talk about it quite a lot because it's very clear that that needs to happen. But in many countries, you may find that natural capital assets are actually transnational, like derivative water systems and so on. So we need to have clear regional policies and regional agreements to make that happen. And what I would call the 4 Ps, the people, the private sector, the public sector, partnerships. These 4 and how that works within the natural capital sector needs to be so clear, because without that, it's then difficult to know what we need to do. Finally, 2 more points is on improving transparency and public records. Improving transparency and public records and creating visibility for what you have and the legal rights, the property rights to them, and how to use them as a potential financial flow for the future. I have only 5 minutes, and I think I've run out of that 5 minutes. But in doing all this, we need to have what I call, it needs to be practical, it needs to be achievable, it needs to be implementable, and it needs to have clear development impacts. So in an acronym, it becomes PAID. So we need to make sure that people who have natural capital are paid for it. Then it becomes an asset. And once it's an asset, then it can become something that can be used for sovereign risk guarantees. Thank you so much.
Kevin, thank you so much. I think the very important points you mentioned, and especially this translation of natural capital in the language of investors, to make it investable, to transfer it, or to design an asset class with understanding the value, having reporting schemes, defining the product. I think this is a very good framework you just mentioned here. And it's also a very good introduction to the next question I would like to ask Ladislas, because if we think about what we just learned, design an asset class, it's always a question of how can we measure it? And so therefore my question would be, how do you handle different quantitative and qualitative measures of the biodiversity impact in different investment strategies? Do you already have something like that, and how do you handle that? Ladislas.
Thank you, Alexander. Well, maybe a first comment on this asset class approach. I think indeed it's very important for investors to identify natural capital as a new asset class. When you speak about biodiversity, actually it's not so easy to address biodiversity and conservation as a financial player. Because even if all activities might have some level of impact on biodiversity, some sectors are much more important than others. And I think one of the most important sectors on biodiversity is the agricultural business. You cannot, I think, properly address biodiversity without tackling our food system. And actually, as a financial players, you tend to have limited exposure to agriculture. You might have some exposure through the agribusiness, but not so much directly on the agricultural land, on farms, etc. And so I think that if you want to have a more positive impact, you need to innovate and to see, as Kevin just said, to see natural capital as a new asset classes. And actually, this is what we have done at Mirova. We have launched in 2017 a business unit dedicated to natural capital, and we report on that as an asset classes to invest directly in nature-related projects. So we invest in agricultural, sustainable agriculture, in sustainable forestry, in sustainable ocean, this kind of thing. Honestly, it's not easy. It has been quite, and I think, Marine, I see that you smile because you have the same kind of concern. This is quite innovative for asset management company to invest in this kind of field. You need to find some project, of course, with a positive impact on biodiversity. So you need to have some people who might have a view whether the project have a positive impact or not on biodiversity. You need to find some project which have some sufficient financial robustness, which is not always so easy. Well, you might have a lot of people who want to develop some impact natural capital project, but to make sure that they will have some financial robust enough with some revenues coming from either from the production of, I don't know, coffee, cocoa, this kind of thing, or either from regulatory schemes such as CO2 conservation, this kind of thing. But to find this kind of project is not so easy. And on the other hand, you need to, I will come to your question, Alexander. You need to convince your clients to invest in this kind of asset class because there are usually not used to this kind of risk, not so willing to invest in this kind of class. So, well, financial institution is a lot about the perception of risk that you might have. And so if you want to convince private investors to invest in this kind of new asset classes, you need to find new ways to prove them that it's possible. I think this is where we need innovation between the public world and the private world. We have launched so our fund dedicated to land degradation neutrality. So the Ldn Fund has worked on creating some bladed finance, so mixing some public capital and some private capital, so that private investors can be reassured by the presence of public investors to invest in this kind of asset classes. But it's not so easy. So regarding then more to the question regarding how we see data, how we assess this kind of impact. So indeed, as you said, if you want to invest in this kind of asset classes, whether it is from a positive side or to avoid some negative impact, you need to have a view on the biodiversity impact. Well, to do that, I think a lot of conversation are around the quantitative data. I think quantitative data is indeed important, but honestly, it is not the first thing that you need to do as an investor to tackle this issue. The first thing you need to do is to invest in skills, to invest in training, to make sure that people who will start to invest in this kind of project, who will look at the investment in corporation who might have some impact on biodiversity, understand biodiversity issues, understand what is behind and the kind of approach you need to implement to face that. And really, this is one message that we push very hard at Mirova, is that sustainability impact as a whole, and it applies a lot to biodiversity, is not only about numbers and figures. It's about understanding what is happening specifically to each kind of investment that you have. You cannot go to a project developer or to a corporation and tell them, I want to speak with you about biodiversity, if you do not even understand yourself what is at stake behind and the specificities it has for the issuers that you are talking to, whether it is a project developer, whether it is a corporate. So the qualitative approach, from my perspective, is really important. Then, of course, having some numbers help, and developing some database on biodiversity is something that we are working a lot on. But actually, developing some meaningful numbers on impact as a whole, and this applies also to biodiversity, is not so easy. If I want, let's say, to understand the biodiversity impact of a large corporation such as McDonald's, to not quote them. If I only focus on the direct impact of McDonald's restaurant, I think I might completely miss the point, because we know that the bulk of the impact will be upstream in the supply chain related to the production of meat. If I want to understand the biodiversity impact of BASF, if I only focus on the production side, again, I will miss the point, because I know that the bulk of biodiversity impact will be related to the kind of product vessel, pesticides and other products for agricultural fields. So looking at data for biodiversity is not only about having some very precise measure about the biodiversity impact of each production site of BASF or each restaurant of McDonald's. It's about having a broad understanding of the whole life cycle of a product, trying to give your best guess about this impact, to try to quantify it, but it will be always something with some kind of subjectivity, with a lot of uncertainty, because you will never be able to understand where BASF products are going to be spread. You will never be able to have a full view of the full supply chain of McDonald's. So we need to have data, but this is more something to help us to understand the big figures, rather than having some very precise numbers for us.
Thanks a lot, Ladislas, and also for your comment. Not the question is important, the answer is important. So thank you very much for that one. Especially that you pointed out, it's not only about quantifying and generating figures. It's about the need to understand the whole life cycle, the whole value chain of the company. And that's why I would like to ask Marine how they are doing that. How they integrate opportunities in risk of biodiversity and natural capital in finance, and what her experience is with this whole process at HSBC. Marine. Your microphone is
on mute, Marine.
You're mute, right?
Yes. Should be better. Well, thank you, Alexander, and thank you for organizing this panel. This is certainly our sector's next frontier. It's very close to my interest, as you mentioned. I've been leading the attention of the group around carbon sinks and also working on the group's sustainability strategy on natural capital. It's the next frontier, but it's not a new topic. It's not coming out of the blue. In terms of risks, first, as you mentioned, HSBC has been developing sector policies since 2004 to manage the way we tackle the risks our financing may have on the environment. Our first sustainability policies was dedicated to forest and products derived from forestry. That was in 2004, as I said. And since then, we have been regularly refined and complementing with a more systematic approach to avoid contribution to deforestation and protected sites, with dedicated policies for agricultural commodities, including palm oil, soil, and other policies dedicated to Ramsar zones. Being said that, as it is with all sustainability issues, there has been less wins on the grounds than losses. As it has been reminded earlier. I mean, we know the figure about the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, the fact that the biodiversity loss is now one of the top 5 risks to the global economy, and the monetary value that is identified by the WWF, for example, is $125 trillion, I think, a year, and the cost of inaction or damage is unevenly priced, but we understand it's high. This understanding is getting traction into the financial industry. We've been led by our sector policies that actually come out from the Equator Principles. And since July 2020, new commitments on biodiversity have been stated, and I quote them: "We support conservation, including with the aim of improving the evidence base for research and decisions related to biodiversity." So meaning now every signatory of the Equator Principles will actually also put a biodiversity lens on top of the climate lens to look at the projects that they finance. It's only part of the work we're doing. Katia, you mentioned the TNFD. Obviously, the financial industry is much more mature with the TCFD, but meaning that we will be much quicker on bringing the biodiversity issues following the TCFD path. And as for TCFD, there are physical, transition, reputational, and financial stability risks linked to biodiversity loss. If we think about physical risks, I mean, pollination, soil fertility, timber loss can adversely affect the production and viability of various industries. It's quite straightforward to understand. The transition and litigation risks. Well, actually, new regulatory changes to support nature conservation can translate into higher costs and or higher risks of litigation if the requirements are not met or not respected. Reputational risks or technological risk can also have an impact on changing consumer habits. I mean, for example, leading to biodiversity damage or restoration and financial gain or loss. Imagine that grazing becomes the trendy demand for any food consumption or meat consumption. That could have quite a systemic impact. Financial stability risks. You've seen that the NGFS has the network on greening the financial system. That network of a central bank have released a paper on embedding environment biodiversity into the wider climate agenda. And it is very likely that the capital adequacy ratio of banks and the solvency ratio of insurers would actually drop significantly if the actual financial risks linked to both climate and biodiversity were included in the calculation of stress tests. For the moment, the exercise around stress tests are more on climate, but we certainly foresee that those stress tests will widen to biodiversity. Evidently, and as briefly stated, any issue are two-sided. Mirova is certainly leading on natural capital funds, and HSBC is also aiming to be a player into that. I mean, last October 9th, the group has announced that it's going to strengthen its ambition to be a leading bank for the transition to net zero. That's going to go through becoming a net zero bank, supporting our customers on their decisive decarbonization pathway and unlocking new climate solution. And within the unlocking new climate solution, the HSBC Asset Management has announced a joint venture with Pollination. Again, Mirova is advanced because it has already financed projects. We're in the process of identifying those projects, and it's not easy, I confirm. Actually, the supply is not endless. The projects are the good project, the one that actually needs to be financed, have to be, for part of them, structured. And so it all takes time, even if it's deeply needed. Well, that's again nothing but an easy task, nor to tackle risk, nor to fuel investment toward natural capital, not because of a lack of demand, but rather measures, data, rules, as far as impact is measured, traded, etc. Well, what I would say is that it's normal, as Stanislas said, I completely agree. We first need to really understand the issue, and it's an investment for the entire financial industry. And I would say that the equivalent of the Lord Stern's review on the economics of climate for biodiversity has just been released in April 2020 with the Dagupta's independent review on the economic of biodiversity. We learned a lot from the first one, and we will be much quicker with the second one.
Thank you so much, Marine, especially for addressing these different risks over here, which is quite important. We'll come to that in Katie's presentation. I just would like to remind the audience here to address questions. You can use the chat function to ask questions, especially if you do not have a finance background. It might be very helpful to ask also just general questions about the topic, because there are different terms we're using, like asset classes or the financial advisors. And this is something Katie Cadworth will address in her speak. Marine, you just mentioned the NGFS and also the role of the central banks. And this is especially where I would like to hand over to Katie, because she is an expert in that field, and she research on the role of central banks and financial supervisor. And I would like to learn more about their way of mitigating nature-related financial risks over there. Maybe you can just give us some insight in your research, Katie.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay? I've got a new headset. Great. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event. Marine, you made some excellent points there, which I really agree with, especially your points on the financial stability risk, which are very relevant to central banks and financial supervisors at the moment. I kind of want to zoom out here a little bit and deliver some of the insights of my recent research on nature-related financial risks and how we're trying to compare these different logics that exist in terms of the financial logic and the financial way of viewing ecological phenomena compared with how ecologists look at these problems and understand these phenomena. And I've attended and spoken at a number of these biodiversity events now over the past 4 to 5 months. And a common mindset I've encountered amongst in financial circles is that the unsustainability of private finance is primarily an information problem. So environmental costs and benefits and risks are not priced into existing markets. We need to resolve these data gaps in order to allow markets to price in externalities. And this is essentially a matter of collective will and ambition. And I don't entirely disagree with this, and I certainly think it's a laudable goal. But the research we've been conducting at ECL has been investigating the extent to which this internalizing externalities logic works when we're dealing with complex ecological phenomena. And we found that there are actually very good theoretical, methodological, and practical reasons why quantitative tools such as environmental reporting, accounting, risk modeling initiatives, some of the things we've been talking about today, why these tools may have inherent limitations in their ability to capture reliable and meaningful estimates of complex ecological processes. And this really brings into foreplay the role of central banks and supervisors, who are, of course, tasked with managing systemic and endogenous risks to the system, where financial institutions cannot manage those risks by themselves. So a first point to make is that the complexity and multidimensionality of environmental threats present enormous and potentially insurmountable challenges for financial measuring and modelling. I think a key point to make is we're not just dealing with biodiversity loss, or even just biodiversity loss plus climate change. The ecological threats here should be more correctly appreciated as multiple biophysical phenomena, all of which interact with each other and with climate change in terms of their human drivers and their impacts. So we prefer to use the term nature-related risks, which is a term that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures has also defined. And importantly, the precise measurement of many of these phenomena is very, very location specific. So to think of this practically, one firm, say an agricultural firm, is going to be both exposed to and responsible for risks including pollinator loss, groundwater depletion, chemical pollution, soil erosion, amongst other things. And each of these risks will have different effects within different local ecosystems and across different points in time. So replicating such granular analysis up to the financial portfolio level, which is what a financial institution would have to do, really implies an almost unmanageable level of complexity unless very broad abstractions are made. And that really leads on to my second point, that even if we do imagine the creation of such a sophisticated database, it actually is methodologically impossible to generate reliable quantitative estimations of outcomes resulting from multiple interacting variables. And this is simply because nature loss and its interaction with the socio-economic domain is actually characterized by a very high degree of system complexity. So it's subject to non-linear dynamics such as feedback loops and tipping points, which ecologists understand are difficult, if not impossible, to estimate with any reliable degree of precision. So for these reasons, we emphasize in our research that biodiversity loss, climate change, amongst other threats, really should be understood as situations of radical uncertainty rather than probabilistic risk, which is what financial models are much more comfortable with dealing with. In the absence of, and this distinction basically means that in the absence of historical trends or known probability distribution functions, the precise timing and magnitude of outcomes in terms of their financial magnitude cannot really be meaningfully estimated. So overall, this means we're not dealing with conventional market failures. There are substantial unknowns involved, which means that the relevant information may never be known to financial markets. And therefore, although they are absolutely necessary and worthwhile, the quantitative tools and initiatives alone are not going to be sufficient to ensure the effective management of nature-related risks, and also to accelerate the greening of financial flows. And importantly, action may need to be taken before precise quantitative estimates can be derived. So we really don't have time to wait around for methodology development, essentially, is the conclusion there. And in our research, I won't dwell too much on this now because I'm conscious of time, but we've tried to explore how direct precautionary interventions, which are justified through qualitative as well as quantitative analysis, are a much more superior means of managing radical uncertainty that characterises nature loss. And Marine mentioned sector lending policies as one initiative they're looking at her institution, and that's exactly the sort of direct intervention that's going to have much more immediate action than waiting for quantitative methodology development. But it also means that it implies a much greater role for regulatory involvement by financial supervisors, who can also kind of set the table for private financial institutions, right, by creating the materiality that's needed to act on these issues. And I can expand on these points in our discussion coming up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. That was your research is really brilliant. It's worth reading. I can just strongly recommend it to the rest of the audience. And I would also like the audience to ask questions if you have any questions, because we are coming right now to the governance question we would like to address here as well. And I would just like to pick up what you just mentioned here in your presentation, Katie, about the data and the use of data, because these policy questions we would like to address here, and I would start with number 4, is what data gaps and inconsistencies exist in public and private biodiversity finance reporting and tracking. And Ladislav already reacted on your presentation, and you would like to comment on the data aspect you would like to mention. So I would like to hand over to Ladislav to just comment on Katie's speech, but also on the policy question we would like to address here.
So maybe first on the data gap. Well, I cannot agree more with what you said, Katie. I feel that actually I hear a lot of people in the financial industry saying that well, they cannot act because they do not have the right data. And I think we can wait decades, maybe more, before we have the right data. And this is just we have to change the way we think about sustainability assessment, because we will never get the same kind of data as we have on financials. The kind of information we're trying to tackle is much more diverse, with a lot of stronger uncertainty. The kind of figures that we try to capture is sometimes very subjective. What price do you want to put on nature? What even if you do not want to speak about price, what is more important between the life of an elephant and the life of an insect? You will never have the answer to this kind of question. But I think it's really wrong to say that we do not have enough information to take some decision and to take some action. Honestly, even if we always can improve sustainability disclosure from corporate, we already have a lot of things on the table. Most corporations publish some sustainability reports of 100 pages. I wonder if so many financial institutions really read it. If you ask people about the sustainability impact of the project, sometimes it's hard to get the information, but in many, many cases, they are willing to provide the best information they got. And it's just that I think that now what we really need to do to integrate the financial world within this fight on sustainability aspect, we need the financial institution to invest more heavily in sustainability research, to have the resource to look at it, to think about it in a different ways. And that's, for me, the major, so it's not a data gap, but it's more an investment gap from the financial institution in skills. You want to say something, Marine?
Yeah. No, please finish. I just, I mean,
but Marine, I would like to ask you something, because if you think about the mainstream investor with a large portfolio who say, I would like to integrate ESG aspects, and I think you might have some of these portfolio managers at HSBC as well. How could they handle that? You just said, Ladislav, they do not read the annual report and they rely on quantified data. So how can we bridge that gap of data availability also for mainstreaming the biodiversity question, like we did with carbon?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Katie and Ladislav were saying. And Alexander, actually, I was going to add something and that completely answers your questions. Yes, we cannot wait, but how do we mainstream? And if we mainstream into asset management or into lending strategies, etc., we need data at some point. Because we're not only gonna develop a dedicated fund or an asset class. We have to tackle the risks of biodiversity loss in the entire investment strategy that we have. And for that, even if our staff are well educated, it's gonna take time. We need to, even if they're well educated, we have limited resources and they have to look at bizarre variation. And on those one, have a more qualified view on why there's a gap in one way or another, and engage, being it again on a lending, financing side as well on asset management. And when we talk about data, I mean, it comes back to one of the main topic of this discussion is that do we have those data? We need them too. And you know that too, as you've launched very useful request for proposal to have those data. And we are looking at what the global biodiversity score of the CDC in France, the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, is proposing. And we are aiming the financial industry as a whole to have anyway a metric. Will it be the mean species abundance per square kilometers? I mean, the science knows better than us, but we strive for one, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Katie, Katja, sorry, I would like to just the one topic in terms of can we bridge that gap, or will the TNFD be able to bridge that gap compared or similar to TCFD? What's your gut feeling on that?
That's a tough question, Alexander. I mean, the TNF, and I see Ladislav smiling as well, actually, who's also on the IWG, the informal working group. So I can also pass on to him for his responses. But right now, how they're working is through the informal working group and the technical expert group. The informal working group consists of around 130 different participants, different stakeholders. And the idea there is really to bring all the different expertise and methodologies that they're beginning to use, that, for example, Marine was referring to from HSBC, but from a whole range of different of groups, to try and see what can be most useful in those steps. I don't know if Ladislav, you would like to add more?
Well, maybe I can react to what Marine said and what you said on the TNFD. So actually, for us, the one way to solve this data gap is to work better with rating agencies. I don't think it makes sense that all financial players develop their own biodiversity database and biodiversity model to rate companies. And even if, well, let's say that one day we have a framework which is manageable which is accepted and manageable by everybody. Does it really make sense to ask all financial players to assess hundreds of times the biodiversity impact of all corporates in the world? So what we have pushed, and the partnership Marine described, is that we have launched a kind of RFP to ask data providers to work on biodiversity impact and to develop something, well, using, for instance, MSA or PDF. Well, there are many units. I'm not going to go into too much technical details, but to develop what the important point is that we want the rating agency to work in close collaboration with some people thinking about the methodology and to see how to apply that on a large set of companies, so thousands of companies, using the existing reporting and not the reporting that we will get tomorrow, well, in 10 years from now, to have the most relevant biodiversity assessment. And we put a strong focus on several things in the RFP. The idea that what we want to capture is not only the financial materiality of biodiversity issues, but to understand what kind of impact companies can have on biodiversity. This is one of the major drawbacks from my perspective of the TCFD, is that the TCFD only have so the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure, has a focus only on financial materiality. So how climate change is going to affect the profitability of companies. I think actually on nature, what is sad is that it usually costs less to destroy nature than to restore it. So if you only focus on financial materiality, you might miss the point on preserving biodiversity. So we put a strong focus on impact within the RFP. We put a strong focus on life cycle approach, as I discussed previously, because we believe that without that, you might completely miss the point. We put a strong focus on the idea that you have to understand the risk related to biodiversity, but also what kind of solutions might help to solve the biodiversity crisis. Because from our perspective, and this is the case for all sustainability investment, being a responsible investor is not only about divesting from negative activities, but it's also about investing in solutions. And if you do not develop some KPIs, some indicators which reflect both this aspect, and I think in the previous conference, one of the speakers said that preserving sea is not only about investing in solutions, it's also about divesting from some solution. But my general message is that if we want to become responsible investors, we need first to divest progressively, at least from impactful activities, and to increase investment in solutions. And so when we develop some KPI, when we develop some indicators, we need to find that also, this idea that it's not only about reducing the impact, but it's also about investing in solution. So this is the kind of principles that we have pushed in the RFP, and we have decided to work with one data provider, which is called Iceberg Data Lab. So we will see how it goes on, and I hope it will be successful. We have just started, and this is the work we have done with AXA, Sycomore, and BNP Asset Management. So we collaborate with the TNFD to push more or less the same kind of idea. As Katia has described, there are hundreds of people around the table at the TNFD, and actually it's not the TNFD yet, it's just the preparation group of the TNFD, which might be start in 1 or 2 years, I don't know from now. So what is sure is that it will take time, and building consensus with such a large set of people with some various perspectives. I think it's important here to mention that in the financial world, you have still a very large part of the industry who still thinks that looking at ESG should be done only if it helps to improve returns. So it's not about being a responsible investor. It's often about just improving financial returns. So I think it's perfectly fine to improve financial returns using some ESG information. But honestly, if we want to solve the biodiversity issue and sustainability issues as a whole, I think we should go beyond that and think about what kind of impact we can have at the same time as having some kind of positive financial returns.
Ladislav, thank you. This is exactly the point where I would like to ask the question or address the next question to Kevin, who just pointed the idea of an asset class with all the different reflection. And this is also linked to a question we got in the chat, asking how can we pursue people that the nature-based assets are worthwhile investing in. So the question is linked to our policy research question number 2. What kind of opportunities are there in the conservation of and sustainable use of biodiversity and natural resources for financial sector? So if we have these data, we discuss all these data questions, but how is this data linked to the financial sector in a way that it generates opportunities? And this is something that is linked to what Kevin pointed out at the beginning. So Kevin, I would like to ask you this question. Yeah. And by the way, we only have, what I just said, we only have 6 minutes left, unfortunately, but I think we started 5 minutes later, so we can end 10 minutes later. I think this is a normal procedure, right? Okay, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, that's why I started with the framing of what we consider as natural capital. Because if you consider natural capital in the terms that we have been discussing it so far with regard to impacts on nature, so financial investments to build an infrastructure, if I want to invest in road and an infrastructure investor, then I see the road as what I want to build, and then ESG comes later in terms of I need to be a responsible investor so I don't impact on ecosystems, I don't impact on nature, I don't impact on the communities that live along the road, and I have to pay compensation or do biodiversity offsets and so on. Then it becomes difficult to structure that biodiversity or the ecosystem services as part of a natural asset that I need to invest in itself. So to convince investors that as biodiversity and natural capital could become a natural asset, we need to do that back-end work of structuring it as an asset class. And if I take, for example, investing in roads, if the investment is also considering not only the negative impacts on biodiversity, but how building that road, that may be a bad example, can actually help to enhance biodiversity as an asset class, and how people who are living in that corridor can actually benefit from that a little bit more. So it comes with knowing the value of natural capital. So the work that the World Bank has done on waves, the evaluation of natural capitals, the work that's been done by Pavan, Sukhdev and co on TEEB, the economics of biodiversity, becomes very important that we try to understand the value of that asset in itself before we, not just the impacts that we have on the asset. That's one way. The other way is using it as a guarantee. That's why I talked about nature-based loans. So if I have gold, for example, a gold reserve, or let me say coal, because that's the one that is soon becoming a stranded asset. And if I know that by keeping it on the soil and conserving it, I'm able to actually leverage resources without actually harvesting that resource, but because I'm keeping it there, then it becomes another way that becomes an asset class. But to do this, we need to change the dialogue that we're having in the biodiversity conventions, which is about conserving biodiversity only, but also now about enhancing the value of biodiversity, adding value, creating farm utility on that particular asset that we're talking about. So these are initial thinking, but in the African Development Bank Group, we're working with the Global Green Growth Institute, GGAP, Global Green Growth Knowledge Platform, to a knowledge partnership to establish what we call a natural capital accounting academy, which is to then try to understand all these perspectives and aspects that will then start bringing this to the mainstream of the discussion of how to finance natural capital. We just had a global convening on this 2 days ago and yesterday, bringing partners to think about how to make this happen. So these are in the initial thoughts on how to make it happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I would like to ask Katie this question as well, because if we have these indicators and we have to translate these indicators into measures that are understood by the capital market, that might be risk and return, and you're focusing on risk on your research. Can you give any hints how we can do that, how we can translate the indicators into risk measures so that also mainstream, Marie mentioned the mainstream investors, that they can take it at least as risk measures into account?
Well, I think in terms of risk, I think taxonomies are going to be a crucial instrument here in terms of creating the robust standards that are required to green finance. And in practice, as we've seen with the EU's sustainable taxonomy, and unfortunately definitions of what is green have been incredibly politically contested on the climate side. And arguably the inclusion of biodiversity and other threats adds significantly more complexity to the task. But I think if there's one thing that's not being emphasized enough here is that we also need to provide robust, standardized definitions of business activities that are unsustainable. Some people call this a brown taxonomy. I personally think this is a term we need to move away from, given its racialized connotations. I prefer the term unsustainable taxonomy or harmful taxonomy. And the rationale for this is twofold, really. Firstly, there is much more scientific consensus on the sorts of business activities that actively drive and contribute to biodiversity loss, which then translate into financial risk, than there is on the flip side, the green side. Things like, for example, the destruction of high carbon stock forests or high conservation value forests, the destruction of other ecosystems such as wetlands and peatlands, which are very important, and the use of fire for the conversion of land, for example. And secondly, failing to define what is unsustainable means we're entrenching the failure to identify financial flows that facilitate these unsustainable activities. So in order to not undermine the very good work being done on the natural capital and the green asset side, there's also an urgent need for governments and multilateral institutions to push for the definition of what also can no longer be financed.
And what do you think, based on your research, will the central banks be something like the crucial trigger on that field? Do they really change? Can they really change something? Or do you think that will be more the regulation you just mentioned with the taxonomy, who will cover in the objectives 3 to 6 right now also biodiversity?
Yeah, I think central banks find themselves in a difficult position here because we can't rely on central banks and financial supervisors alone to resolve environmental breakdown. That would be ridiculous and definitely beyond their mandates for preserving price and financial stability. On the other hand, if they don't act to mitigate these threats where they intersect with the financial system, they risk failing to deliver on their own mandates. So they find themselves in a difficult position. And what we argue is that actually, given that nature loss does pose price and financial stability risks, it is within their existing mandates to at least do something. And I really think they should be coordinating with other areas of government, most notably finance ministries and environmental ministries, to define the sorts of activities that can no longer be financed. So in our research, we recommend the definition of what we call an exclusionary list, which would, act in a similar way to an unsustainable taxonomy. and incorporating those activities that can't be financed into existing monetary policy and regulatory toolkits. So, for example, assets which are linked to the financing of these unsustainable activities could be excluded from asset purchase portfolios and from collateral requirements. And there could also be higher risk ratings attached to the capital requirements of these assets, like Marine touched on. So, you know, I think that there's a lot that can be done with central banks, but I don't think we can rely on them in total. I think policy coherence and policy coordination is going to be crucial for this going forward.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are already 2 minutes late. So therefore, I would like to thank the panel for this wonderful, really wonderful discussion. The scene setting of Katja, the practical perspective of Ladislav, with a lot of experience from the implementation of biodiv in investment processes. Marine's experience from HSBC with a large bank, which is not as flexible as a smaller one, but you're doing it. And of course, Kevin with his idea on asset classes and what are the demands of an asset classes, how to design it. And Katie with her insights on her research, with the role of central banks, and linked to that the question of risk and how to address that. So therefore, thank you very much to all of you for this wonderful discussion. It was a pleasure, even if we did not cover all the aspects we would like to cover, but it was, from my point of view, a very challenging panel. So thanks a lot to all of you.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you very much, Alexandra, Bassen, for your able moderating. It was a very, very exciting, proactive, interactive, what I meant to say, session. And I'm sure the audience and participants online enjoyed it very